I find it extremely ironic that a black woman is denigrating conservative values for the very same reasons the black community will never stop being a victim, constantly biting the hand that feeds them while still retaining a perpetual victim mentality, but still cashing their checks at the first of the month. Well, alright then. La 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 la. Approximately 5 or 6 months ago, I released one of my favorite videos, Punk is Dead, or as it's now titled, The Tragic Decline of the Punk Rock Attitude. A more dramatic title, perhaps, but a necessary adjustment. Despite what the original name may have implied to some, the video was never about the music or the fashion. It used punk as a backdrop for a much broader cultural critique. One about a rot so persistent that it even seeps into the subcultures built to resist it. Many failed to grasp that aim, even though I said it within the first 5 minutes. Some got sidetracked listing modern punk bands as if citing names on a playlist could disprove a cultural diagnosis. Others confidently assumed the video's argument while admitting they hadn't bothered to even watch it. And perhaps most disappointingly, those who did engage with its core premise often fell back on a simplistic, uncritical reframe that I was overcomplicating things and that punk is just about being yourself. But what does that even mean? Being yourself. This phrase, so often offered as a counterpoint to analysis, appears deceptively simple. Know thyself is a maxim that traces back to at least Socrates, a philosopher who understood that selfhood is not a static truth. Instead, it is a riddle with a solution beginning with the recognition of personal ignorance. For Socrates, the act of knowing oneself required humility, discomfort, and a relentless dismantling of illusion. To truly be oneself means to interrogate instinct and relinquish contented self-satisfaction. In doing so, we may begin to understand identity as an unfolding question rather than an all-encompassing answer. By my analysis, the core of punk, philosophically, is this very pursuit. The search for authenticity. And I do say pursuit intentionally to emphasize authenticity as a continuous, often challenging process of self-examination. Too often, we misrepresent being you as a fixed destination that requires no further effort after being attained. In truth, one must dismantle the social scripts they have unconsciously adopted and the rituals they inherited unquestioningly.
He moved from New York City, the mecca and hub of the cultural world, to Utah. Nowhere to change nothing, more to perpetuate this cycle of money, greed, fascism, and triviality. I mean, your movement of the people, by the people, and for the people got you nothing.
By doing so, one can begin to uncover their foundational beliefs and examine their behaviors more honestly. And that kind of self-examination doesn't just stop at ideology or aesthetics. It extends into how we navigate the digital world. Every day, our data is quietly harvested, sold, and weaponized to manipulate not just our spending habits, but our identities. This is done by data brokers, and legally, they have to remove your information if you ask them to, but they make it very hard for you to do so. Which is why I am proud to be sponsored by Aura, the all-in-one digital security solution that helps you take back control of your online presence. Aura protects against identity theft, financial fraud, and data breaches by proactively monitoring your information and alerting you in near real time if something looks suspicious. In a world where surveillance capitalism thrives on our passivity, Aura offers a way to push back, to move through the internet consciously, securely, and with more intention. If you're looking for a smarter way to manage your digital footprint and keep your personal information secure, Aura is a solid place to start. You can try it for free for 2 weeks by visiting aura.com/unpoeticjustice or by using the link in the description box below. Thank you, Aura, for sponsoring another video. And while we're still here, make sure you guys go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel. Please and thank you. So personal assessment is daunting. It's often quiet, internal, and deeply unglamorous. Authenticity requires a rejection of performativity in favor of continued, often private critique that dissects one's impulses. By understanding that our immediate inclinations do not define us, it becomes apparent that life is comprised of endless introspective projects aimed at creating rather than uncovering one's own essence. To piece together what it means to be you is an intellectual challenge. It forces reflection, invites paradox. You may find yourself chasing the answer in endless loops, only to realize the question itself was the point. But many of the commenters under that video had little interest in this pursuit. For them, being yourself was both the beginning and the end of the conversation. Any attempt to go further, to suggest that it might be worth thinking about a little bit more deeply, was met with frustration and even hostility. And that hostility, it's telling, because beneath it often lies a more deeply rooted and potent emotion. There's no shortage of discourse lately about the rise of intellectualism. Think pieces, hot takes, and video essays all attempting to chart its cause. Why are people so hostile to complexity, and what does that defensiveness say about our culture? Now, I could give you an academic definition of intellectualism, and maybe later on I will, but for now, here's what it means to me. Intellectualism is the act of thinking about thought. It's the practice of unraveling the obvious until it no longer feels intuitive. It's a desire to challenge what we're told makes sense.
Who's ever written the great work about the immense effort required in order not to create? Intensity without mastery. The obsessiveness of the utterly passive. And could it be that in this passivity, I shall find my freedom?
It's the insistence that there is always more beneath the surface, and that surface, more often than not, is simply a facade. Much of the discourse around anti-intellectualism frames it as something novel, but I'm uninterested in that argument, because it's not new. As Richard Hofstadter once wrote, anti-intellectualism is founded in the democratic institutions and sentiments of this country. What I'm interested in is one of its oldest and most overlooked fuel sources: fear. Now, contrary to some progressive narratives, I don't believe conservatism is inherently devoid of value. In a different world, one where fundamental rights weren't constantly under siege, thoughtful conservatism could serve as a vital counterbalance to progressive momentum. It could raise necessary questions like, is this new idea actually better than the old one? What deserves to be preserved and why? In that imagined world, conservatism would be about prudence and care, not dogma. It would demand slow change and careful scrutiny, not just for tradition's sake, but to understand and be wary of the potential consequences of a societal shift. In this version of conservatism, the rise of generative AI would have been met not with panic, but with deliberate hesitation. These conservatives would have asked, is this genuinely better than what we already have right now? They would have demanded regulation, oversight, and a gradual rollout. They would have insisted on a transition that allowed people and industries time to adapt. But that is not the world we inhabit. In our reality, modern American conservatism, particularly at the institutional level, functions not through inquiry, but through manipulation and control. Instead of embracing AI as a tool to alleviate human suffering and improve lives, it is seen as a cost-cutting measure only. As such, its use is justified by efficiency, where it might otherwise be carefully implemented to ensure an overall better quality of life without the intent to replace meaningful human contribution. The question of what happens to people after their jobs vanish is treated as peripheral, if it is even considered at all. Today, conservatism, especially in its most vocal forms, is motivated not by reasoned skepticism, but by fear. Fear of loss, fear of uncertainty, and fear of change. And fear, it's an incredibly effective tool. It keeps systems inert and people obedient, thereby preserving established power structures. In the tragic decline of the punk rock attitude, I took shots at conservatives. Hell yeah. But leftists caught some strays too, as they often do on my channel. And to their credit, many on the left engaged with the critique, some positively, some defensively, some indifferently, but they engaged. I can at least say that many on the left still value the act of thinking. I cannot say the same for the political and online right. There, intellectual curiosity is too often replaced by reaction, dismissal, or rage. But my criticism of conservatism wasn't flampant. It was foundational. Modern conservatism as it currently exists stands in direct contradiction contradiction to the ethos of punk. Punk values authenticity. Conservatism clings to conformity. Punk demands that we question what we've been told. Conservatism demands we obey it. Contemporary conservatism relies on sameness, not as a side effect, but as a strategy. It needs uniformity to preserve tradition and expand its influence. That's not a hyperbole, it's a structural truth. And this is the point that seems to have provoked so much visceral backlash, especially from a familiar demographic. Often white Gen X men still clutching to the fantasy that punk was always about studded jackets, sneering, and vaguely defined rebellion, rather than existential unrest and cultural disobedience. I'm not interested in relitigating the contents of that video though. The arguments stand on their own. What struck me long after the comment section settled was a more difficult question. Why does intellectual content, especially if it touches on some form of identity, evoke such a visceral backlash? By extracting meaning from the fear entangled in rage and sometimes even bigotry, I hope to unravel a more meaningful truth from the defensiveness. When we pull at the mask of who we think we are, do our trepidations come from sound concerns, or are we afraid that there might be nothing substantial underneath to even reveal? The fear I saw in that comment section and around the world right now speaks a lot louder than the insults that spawn from insecurity. It speaks more than what most are willing to admit. When I see people reject nuance, scoff at theory, or lash out at ideas that demand introspection, I'm not witnessing a sudden cultural shift. I'm seeing a long American tradition unfold, one rooted in apprehension, control, and the strategic vilification of thinking itself. Richard Hofstadter captured this phenomenon clearly in Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, where he argued that the suspicion of intellect has been embedded in the American psyche for centuries. He didn't frame it as ignorance, but as a cultural hostility towards complexity and reflection, values that challenge the moral clarity and certainty so often idealized in American life. Hofstadter wrote that anti-intellectualism is founded in the resentment of life of the mind and those who devote themselves to it, a sentiment that rings as true today as it did in the mid-20th century. This resentment back then metastasized in the 1950s during the Red Scare and McCarthy era, when intellectuals, particularly those in universities, were painted as potential threats to national security.
One communist on the faculty of one university is one communist too many.
In No Ivory Tower, McCarthyism and the Universities, Ellen Schrecker shows how deeply academia was infiltrated and reshaped by political paranoia. Professors were surveilled, fired, and blacklisted not for actions but for their ideas. Universities became battlegrounds to contain free thought instead of bolstering it. The pursuit of knowledge, especially knowledge that questioned American exceptionalism or capitalism, was recast as dangerous subversion. What Schrecker exposes is crucial. McCarthyism didn't just punish dissent, it made the act of thinking dangerous. The university, supposedly the sanctuary for critical inquiry, became a hostile place for those unwilling to conform. And that legacy still lingers. The fear that dominated that era has evolved. The suspicion of academics and the framing of intellectual work as elitist or out of touch still shapes how people engage or refuse to engage with complexity today. In a society more comfortable with answers than questions, we often see intellectualism diagnosed as a conclusive threat. We have inherited a country that teaches us to fear the abstract, to distrust the thinker, and to equate critique to disloyalty. Today, we see anti-intellectualism in school board meetings where books are banned for being too political or too confusing.
We know that books are continuing to be purged. We know student library aids have been banned. We know a group of non-parents have pushed for these book removals and continue to do so.
We see it in the rhetoric of politicians who dismiss public health experts and climate scientists as alarmists while positioning their own ignorance as some type of heroic common sense. We see it on social media where people mock the language of academia or philosophy, labeling it as pretentious simply because it didn't bend to the lowest common denominator. Take, for example, the backlash to diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives.
I do believe we have a disagreement when it comes to DEI. You think it stands for didn't earn it. Essentially that colleges are dropping the bar, but I think they're just opening the door.
If I was talking to a group of Hispanic or black people, and I happen to say you people, is that a microaggression?
I would think so, yes.
Okay, I think that's insane.
Why?
Because it's not a microaggression or racism to call any group of people you people. That's DEI in practice.
It's not just a debate over policy, but a rejection of the very intellectual frameworks that underpin them, like systemic analysis, historical critique, or intersectionality. We can also look at the outrage over college professors discussing settler colonialism and gender as a spectrum, as though the presence of those ideas is an attack rather than an invitation to examine how we arrived at our current cultural assumptions. Even AI, as I mentioned earlier, is wrapped in this. The technology is not praised for how it can advance collective knowledge, but how it can replace labor, strip down expertise, and make thinking a service outsourced to code. We're no longer asked to understand, we're offered conveniences instead. And in that convenience, the cultural muscle for sustained thought begins to atrophy. So when people scoff at philosophy or react to theoretical discourse with knee-jerk rage, it's not just because they're disinterested. It's because they've been taught by history, by politics, by culture, that thinking too hard is suspicious, that asking why too many signs is a sign of dubious rebellion. And rebellion, ironically enough, in a country that romanticizes it, is only acceptable when it's loud and shallow, not quiet and intellectual. The fear I see under so many anti-intellectual reactions online is rooted in an insidious repetition of uneasy sentiments from a society that never unlearned its distrust of the mind. Following the reflexive uproar about complexity, the loud dismissals of overthinking, a subtle echo reveals a quieter, more personal fear of being left behind. There is an existential lament that comes with change. As widely held values become rejected by the same world that once cultivated them, once developed standards face obsolescence. At its core, anti-intellectualism does not necessarily uplift willful ignorance. Instead, it often aims to subdue the weight of insignificance caused by a cultural landslide, crushing those reluctant to adapt. From this, anger and confusion erupt in response to conversations inviting revision, nuance, and historical reckoning. Through these deliberations, it becomes apparent that there are cracks in the foundation of value systems that once supported now outdated identities.
You need proper blokes to sort it out. And trying to sweep that under the carpet with this new era of woke is unacceptable to me. It's, you know, we need men's men. I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is.
However, intellectualism did not create fractures in the constructs around which people have built their sense of self. It merely revealed a long-standing instability. Thomas Schaller and Paul Waldman dissect this phenomenon in White Rural Rage, The Threat to American Democracy. Their research shows that rural right conservatives, especially older men, are not merely reacting to economic loss, but to cultural loss. They are no longer the unquestioned center of American political or moral authority, and such displacement breeds rage, not because someone took something from them, but because the symbolic order has changed. What was once revered is now questioned. What was once fringe is now mainstream. It's not their country anymore, not in a narrative sense. A powerful contemporary example of this transition is the evolving American discourse on Israel and Palestine. For decades, support for Israel was among the few bipartisan sacred topics in American politics. To question that support, even mildly, was to risk being branded as a dangerous individual who was at best anti-American and at worst anti-Semitic. But over the past decade, especially in recent years, that narrative has begun to shift. Younger generations, influenced by online media, activist voices, and post-colonial frameworks, have begun asking uncomfortable questions. What is the moral cost of unwavering support, and what are we legitimizing with our silence? It became increasingly clear that unreasoned solidarity was not justifiable in the face of asymmetrical violence. Now, this cultural shift is not absolute, not even close, but it is still significant, and it appears profoundly threatening to many.
Stop killing children! Stop killing children! Stop killing.
The cognitive dissonance it generates can be intense. If you have spent your life believing that American support for Israel was an unquestionable moral stance, a pillar of freedom and democracy, then suddenly being told that this support may enable apartheid or ethnic cleansing is not just shocking, it's destabilizing. It makes you question what else you are wrong about. It makes you feel like the ground beneath you is eroding away. For many, anti-intellectualism serves not as a conscious ideology, but as a defense mechanism, a proverbial sealant that quickly patches visible fissures in one's reasoning. Instead of confronting possible shortcomings, the tenets of non-thinking allow one to cling a little longer to what is old and eroding. By seeing criticisms as woke propaganda, they can avoid the possibility that they were convinced to champion injustice by constructing a global political framework based on selective empathy. And again, this is what Hofstadter warned about. The American resentment toward the life of the mind had manifested because the mind is restless. While we may crave comfort, the mind interrogates familiarity and pulls at the threads of tradition. As a sense of complacency begins to unravel, the process can feel like a betrayal to one's identity woven within those very threads starts to destabilize. In this sense, world rage, as described by Schaller and Waldman, is not directed at liberalism or leftism, whatever you want to call it, themselves, but at what the ideologies represent. The threat of being rendered narratively irrelevant. The same emotional logic applies when people rail against decolonial theory, gender studies, critical race theory, support for Palestine or Sudan. It's not always that they misunderstand the ideas. It is that the ideas make them feel obsolete. While we may be quick to vilify fear, a very human reaction, the true tragedy lies in the refusal to evolve. As opposed to grappling with change, many choose to attack the agents of it, because if they cannot be the center of the conversation in the new narrative, then they would rather silence it altogether. This is where the conversation loops back to the philosophy of punk, because its ultimate goal is to reject compulsive acts of reassurance in favor of digging towards something more real. In this aim, there is an acceptance that the truth may be ugly or that it might even hurt you. However, as intellectualism reveals, a worthwhile life cannot be sustained upon the foundation of illusion, even if that illusion is pretty. At some point, the ground beneath you will give out. In contrast, by refusing to live in bad faith, one commits to an ever-reaching goal. Through intense analysis, introspection, dissection of norms, and constant self-improvement, a necessary discomfort arises that, in the long run, contributes to a higher state of being. The pursuit of authenticity offers clarity and a sense of liberation, equipping one with the skills necessary for adaptation without abandoning personal needs. Though not always academic, this process is inherently reflective and curious. Therefore, ultimately, it is violently incompatible with anti-intellectualism, which thrives on fear. So in this specific context, when people dismiss intellectual critiques as overthinking, they are misinterpreting punk rock's core ethos. Punk has never been about comfort. It has never been about doubling down on the past just because it feels familiar. It's about tearing down the walls around you until only what is true remains, even if it's small, even if it's broken, even if it contradicts what you once believed. But at the very least, the choice to do this leaves an opportunity to rebuild towards something more meaningful. That is why modern intellectualism is not only politically troubling, it is philosophically cowardly. It is a rejection to the very process that makes punk powerful. Because if you are unwilling to interrogate the systems around you, and more importantly, the systems within you, you are not being authentic. You're just being fucking loud. And loudness without reflection is not punk. It is only a form of conformity that has been distorted.
Tonight, the Sick Sad World primetime special with people just like you only more pathetic.
There's a treacherous, more hostile face of intellectualism, one not dressed in irony or apathy, but an outright bigotry. In the comment section of the tragic decline of the punk rock attitude, this showed up with almost clinical predictability. Amid the thoughtful feedback, the earnest disagreement, and the usual internet noise, there were sharp, loud, and deeply telling outbursts of racism. These weren't just trolls or throwaway insults, they were ideologically based reactions. These detractors ignored all arguments with the intent of establishing who could speak on the topic. They were telling someone, me, in effect, you don't belong in this conversation. In fact, you don't belong, period. They were attempts to delegitimize intellectual engagement by invalidating the speaker based on race, identity, age, or perceived outsider status. Bigotry, in this sense, becomes the laziest and most hostile rejection of thought. It disregards the need for evidence and curiosity to remove demographic undesirables from a space in a vain attempt to safeguard a fragile sense of self. And it thrives in environments where reflection is already suspect. It is the rhetorical equivalent of sticking your fingers in your ears and screaming. Where insecurity hides behind bravado, and where culture is treated not as a commons, but as private property. In alternative spaces, there is always rhetoric surrounding the need to weed out posers and prevent assimilation into the mainstream. By positioning diversity and inclusion as a conventional standard in a woke world, so i.e. the mainstream world, marginalized individuals tangentially become easy targets.
It's because there were people who involved in this music scene or whatever referred to Los Crudos as a sick band. Oh yeah, a sick band. Oh yeah, but Martin's cool. No, that's what was said. Oh yeah, that's but Martin's a cool guy. No, fuck you, I'm not a cool guy.
What's particularly haunting is how easily bigotry cloaks itself in cultural protectionism, how often its reactionary instinct masquerades as nostalgia. The angry cries of punk being corrupted or co-opted aren't really about memory or preservation. They're about control. They invoke the language of authenticity, but their aim is exclusion. What they are doing is reasserting a narrow definition of who gets to belong, who gets to speak, and who is allowed to be seen as a thinking, feeling, and self-aware subject. It's not about saving punk. It's about conserving a now outdated image of dissent. I don't fit the stereotype visage of past punk speakers. So, no matter the message voice or how well reasoned, it is not from the mouth of someone belonging to that space. In this instance, bigotry goes beyond a social failure into a failure of imagination, a failure to see the full humanity of others, and a refusal to engage with the complexity that a thinking world demands. It reduces identity to caricature and thought to threat, lashing out not only at ideas, but also at the bodies of those who dare to carry them. It punishes curiosity by tying it to identity and dismissing both. But punk again offers the counterweight. Punk never belonged to whiteness, to maleness, to straightness, to suburbia. Punk was born in discomfort and marginalization, and voices that didn't ask for permission to yell. To say someone can't engage with punk or critique it because of who they are, or rather who you perceive them to be, is to completely misunderstand what punk was always meant to be. A place where you could stand outside of the norms. If authenticity is the heartbeat of punk, then bigotry is its flatline. It's static. It's fear clinging to the past, unwilling to question its foundations. And it is, at its root, anti-intellectual, not because it lacks education, but because it refuses reflection, because it chooses anger over honesty, control over conversation. So when you watch the tragic decline of the punk rock attitude, you may feel some discomfort, but that's the point. Who told you punk was supposed to be easy? It's supposed to be authentic. An authentic critique doesn't care if it offends your nostalgia or unpacked prejudices.
My thing, what I hope to do all the time, is to be so completely myself, which that's what I hope I am, to be so much myself that my audiences and even people who meet me are confronted. They're confronted with what I am, inside and out, as honest as I can be. In this way, they have to see things about themselves immediately.
In tandem with this phenomenon is another somewhat under-examined facet of anti-intellectualism: the tendency for people to demand an intellectual's appearance to confirm their pre-established generalizations.
Isn't there any time when how you look doesn't affect how you're judged?
When you donate an organ, unless it's your eyes.
Usually this means an individual is appraised based on superficial characteristics, so a person might be discredited purely because they don't look intellectual. Similarly, if the speaker does not have the demeanor of authority on a subject matter, they may also be disregarded. Oftentimes, ideas are rejected not because they lack merit, but because of who is presenting them. It's the right message, wrong speaker phenomenon, which can manifest itself in a variety of ways. Sometimes it's through prejudice. A concept or critique that might have been celebrated when delivered by someone with institutional credentials or demographic privilege can be met with hostility, suspicion, or mockery when it comes from someone who defies those norms, especially women, people of color, queer individuals, or people simply speaking from outside traditional academic spaces. For my video on punk, I was not the right speaker for select commenters. We can certainly place some of that on their bigotry, but I would broaden the issue beyond only racism. It's not just that I'm visibly black, it's that I subverted the expectations they hold for what a black woman should sound like in political discourse. An intentional decision on my part was to refrain from centering identity-focused discussions on race, queerness, or gender. Instead, I chose to speak more philosophically, self-inserting occasionally, but only with experience that frankly could apply to anyone. However, many commenters immediately made assumptions about my arguments and perspectives solely based on my visible characteristics. They didn't actually listen. They relied on superficial patterns they've observed in left-leaning spaces and slotted me into a category before I even spoke. It wasn't just those on the right-leaning side. Plenty of left-leaning viewers fell into similar traps, questioning absurd things like the pirate flag that was in the background of the video, which was apparently a divorced man thing to own. Though probably made to be sarcastic or cheeky, that kind of comment reflects the same instinct: to stereotype, to reduce, to distract. It shows how even those who claim to value open discourse can be quick to discredit or misinterpret someone who doesn't conform to their pre-sorted ideological boxes. Why would a black woman have a pirate flag? The stereotypes on all sides become the barrier. They prevent actual dialogue because I'm expected to engage sincerely with this type of foolishness, as if the distraction itself was worthy of a response. In Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, Hofstadter points out how American culture has always been skeptical of people who presume to teach, especially when those people don't fit within established power structures. Intellectuals are tolerated when they stay in their lane, when they are calm, polite, collected, and institutionally approved. But when thinkers come from the outside or challenge the rules of the game itself, they are not just ignored, they are punished. And this rejection doesn't always come from hatred necessarily. More often it comes from the fear of not being in control, or fear of hearing truth in an unfamiliar voice, fear of confronting the possibility that authority might not look or sound the way they thought it would. The discomfort people feel doesn't always come from the content of ideas being shared. It can come from the collapse of a certain internalized narrative, that intelligence has a certain look, a certain tone, a certain resume. It's this fear that also drives what Ellen Schrecker documents in No Ivory Tower. During the McCarthy era, even scholars with all the right credentials were blacklisted and silenced for holding dangerous views. Their institutional legitimacy didn't protect them. In fact, it made them even bigger targets. That period wasn't just about controlling ideas, it was about maintaining the image of who gets to have them, and any deviation from that narrative can be a threat. Even now, credibility is more of a performance than principle. Tone, accent, posture, platform, these things carry more weight than the content of the idea. This is is why people often look to the English as the intellectuals on the YouTube platform for some fucking reason. This is anti-intellectualism operating under the guise of credibility policing. If people are going to hear big ideas, they often need to hear them from those who they feel safe with. This means looking the part so the audiences don't have to reevaluate their biases in the midst of tangling with other complex ideas. Ironically, even in spaces where discourse surrounding topics like bias and stereotyping are welcomed, listeners would still rather hear from those who fit an appropriate mold. Notably, these expectations extend beyond a marginalized speaker, setting implicit standards for desirable archetypes within societal groupings. For me, this means not only speaking on topics I'm expected to, but aptly performing my identity in the process. It's not an accident that the two biggest videos on my channel both deal with race, i.e. I'm black, so people expect for me to talk about race, and that's acceptable for me. In this sense, credibility is often just another code word for conformity, and when intellectualism strays from that code, when it is embodied in the wrong body, spoken in the wrong register, delivered through the wrong platform, it is attacked as flawed, as illegitimate. The ideas might be right, the analysis may be sharp, the message may be necessary, but the speaker isn't what they expected, and the whole thing becomes cringe, pretentious, angry, or radical. And yet there is another layer to this dynamic, a reversal that reveals the trap even more clearly. Just as some are dismissed for being too informal or too unpolished, others are discounted for being too academic, for speaking in ways deemed inaccessible, even when they're not speaking from privilege but from hard-earned literacy. This charge is often leveled at marginalized thinkers who choose a more analytical or rigorous style, and it operates with the same effect, to delegitimize, to other, to silence. Suddenly, clarity is mistaken for condescension. Complexity is reframed as arrogance. And once again, the content is ignored because the performance doesn't match the viewer's expectations. This contradiction, where one can simultaneously be too raw and too refined, exposes that what is often being policed is not communication, but presence. Who gets to sound smart, and in what way? Who gets to be heard without translation? Who is allowed to take up space in intellectual discourse without apology or adjustment? This creates a chilling effect. It teaches people not just to second guess their ideas, but to question whether they're even allowed to have them, whether allowed to express them without first proving they deserve the microphone. And that, perhaps more than any political campaign or algorithmic force, is what sustains anti-intellectualism. Less of the rejection of thought and more of a relentless narrowing of who gets to think out loud. It's time then to not ask just what we believe, but why we believe it, why we trust some voices and instinctively distrust others, why we let certain ideas resonate only when they arrive in a familiar tone from a familiar face. Because until we confront those reflexes, we will continue to mistake style for substance and leave the most necessary conversations completely unheard.
All that trying hard shit. That shit just corny. Where you going?
I'm about to go skate this gap. Try hard, be corny, right?
There is yet another dimension to anti-intellectualism, one that feels contemporary, but in truth is just a modern mutation of long-standing insecurities. Among younger generations, particularly Gen Z and the emerging Gen Alpha, resistance to intellectualism is often aesthetic instead of ideological. Instead of disagreeing with ideas directly, there is a focus on how one postures it. It's about the vibes, the aura, and above all, it's about what's cringe. In these digital generations, where every moment can be clipped, captioned, and virally ridiculed, the worst thing you can do is not necessarily be ignorant, it's to try too hard. To care publicly about something complex, abstract, or controversial is to risk vulnerability in a culture that weaponizes mockery with frightening precision. If someone sees you reading theory, sharing a thoughtful video essay, or asking a deep question in class or online, you're immediately running the risk of being branded as a try-hard, pretentious, or worse, cringe. But this rejection of seriousness isn't apathy, it's anxiety. It reflects a generation that has been socialized to see emotional exposure as dangerous. Ideas take a back seat to the anticipation of ridicule in response to empathetic expressions. What emerges is a culture of preemptive self-effacement, where detachment becomes a defense mechanism, but irony has become the loophole. We can see this most clearly on TikTok, where parody content often becomes the only socially acceptable way to express intellectual curiosity or emotional depth. A user might post a parody video pretending to be a philosophy student, mocking the way they talk about Kant or Foucault, but the comments will reveal that people are listening, they're thinking, they're curious. The parody is the armor. It allows people to engage with ideas without fully committing to them. So if someone mocks them, they can just say, relax, it's just a joke. In this context, satire becomes a Trojan horse for sincerity. Even earnest content often has to be padded with layers of absurdism or self-deprecation to even be palatable. But this shows us that people do want to think, that they do want to learn, but they want to do it behind the safety of a punchline.
You see, when you try but fail, people think you're a loser. But if you skip the trying and decide to fail right away, then everyone thinks you got the talent, but you're too cool to waste it on them.
And this tendency, the need to package thoughtfulness as performance, reveals just how unsafe genuine intellectualism feels to so many young people. It's not that they don't care, it's that they've learned that it's dangerous to look like they care. And then there's contrarianism, a trend that operates as the mirror image of the same insecurity. A new generation of creators have figured out that the fastest way to signal intelligence without risking vulnerability is to reject the consensus outright.
It seems that TikTok wants to shadow ban me once again, so let's do the most harshest unpopular opinions I have ever fucking filmed. Now the intro is going to be short, sweet and meaningful. If I upset you, fuck off. Fuck off. I don't care. Never will, never have, will not care. Without further ado, let's start dragging some people's name through the fucking dirt.
If everyone says something is good, they say it's bad. If a social justice cause is popular, they question the motives behind it. If a complex theory is being explained, they dismiss it as academic fluff. This rarely is rooted in critical thought. It's just a reflexive rejection to preserve their control. Being contrarian gives the illusion of insight while keeping a safe distance from genuine engagement. But the problem with contrarianism in its reactive form is that it often masquerades as independent thinking while actually being just another form of conformity, just inverted. Instead of parodying the mainstream, it parrots the backlash. It's still reactive and still dependent on the crowd. True intellectualism requires stepping outside of both echo chambers and rejections. It requires asking why, not just saying no. There is a deep emotional toll to all of this. A generation raised on surveillance by algorithms, by audiences, by each other, has developed an implicit fear of being perceived. Vulnerability has become currency, and most would rather go bankrupt than to spend it in public. What we lose in the process is more than just depth of thought. It's the willingness to think out loud in the first place. Punk, by contrast, was never about avoiding embarrassment. It was about running headfirst into it. It was about saying the thing that no one wanted to say, not to go viral or to prove a point, but because it mattered to you. Because the truth, however messy or awkward it is, was worth shouting. Being human means fumbling with concepts not yet within our reach, struggling to find words and methods for effective self-expression. The remedy to this common struggle is to just get your hands dirty and pick passion over perfection. Effort is the only way to get over a new hurdle. Pretending not to care in the first place means remaining stagnant, never clearing goals or learning lessons. Punk didn't care if it was cringe, it thrived in the cringe. Punk is basically yelling into a microphone about something you may only halfway understand but care about fully. It is the antithesis of irony-soaked detachment. It demands you show your face even if it's red with embarrassment. If intellectualism feels awkward, if it feels vulnerable or embarrassing, you're probably doing something right. That's the signal that something is happening. The challenge for emerging generations is to see that this is not a flaw, but a strength. To understand that effort isn't weakness, and that being wrong is not the end of thought, but the beginning of the interrogation. Punk taught us to be loud, but it also taught us to be real. And real in this culture might just mean allowing yourself to give a damn, even if that makes people uncomfortable, but especially if it makes you uncomfortable. Whether it's the fear of obsolescence masked as bigotry, the dread of being seen trying too hard, or the projection of narrow expectations onto people who refuse to be palatable, anti-intellectualism ultimately reveals itself as a repetitive and exhausting cycle. As I always say, this is not a new phenomenon. It simply changes clothes to fit the moment, sometimes donning the language of populism, sometimes cloaked in irony, and other times it hides behind the false sense of confidence of tradition. At the center of this cycle is the idea of social blinders. Our understanding of the world is often shaped by the environments we live in and what they permit us to see. Most people don't consciously reject intellectualism. They live inside structures that never ask them to think deeply in the first place. Younger generations often operate in digitally progressive spaces where the language of activism and inclusion is so ubiquitous that it becomes normalized. Concepts like gender fluidity, mental health advocacy, or fat acceptance aren't questioned, they are assumed. And because these ideas are presented as givens, their intellectual and historical foundations are often left unexplored, resulting in these younger generations taking the progression for granted, never quite realizing they've inherited a world shaped by movements they've never felt, never fought for, and thus never questioned. They live within the consequences of transformation, but rarely understand the cost of it, which inhibits progression that requires hardy analysis. Older generations, by contrast, experience change constantly and often unwillingly. They see their familiar frameworks replaced by unfamiliar norms. For them, the change is not invisible, it's inescapable. The language has shifted, the symbols have changed, and the moral center feels unstable. Without context, such changes feel like an erasure. Underneath this generational tension is a deeper, more subtle truth. We've become deeply accustomed to passive living. Technology has made things effortless. Instant access, instant delivery, instant gratification. Our lifestyles are structured around convenience, automation, and algorithmic thinking. We built a world where effort is no longer required to survive. So when we're asked to exert intellectual effort, to read deeply, to reflect critically, to endure ambiguity, it all feels kind of unnatural. It feels like work in a culture that prizes ease. In a society where idleness is often mistaken for peace, the demand to think critically becomes threatening. It implies that your comfort might not be earned, that your opinions might not be sufficient, and that your passivity might be the problem. Effort in this context may feel like a personal attack. It diminishes perceived values of leisure, of instinct, of just being yourself. This is how anti-intellectualism becomes seductive. It justifies idleness, it flatters ignorance, it lets people confuse ease with truth. When discomfort arises, when someone introduces a difficult idea or questions a widely accepted belief, mockery becomes the shield. Ridicule becomes the weapon. It's easier to call something cringe or overthought or trying too hard than to admit that you've never considered it. So the cycle persists. An idea surfaces. It disrupts someone's comfort. They reject it, not because it's wrong, but because it demands effort. Others agree, and that shared rejection forms a culture. Anti-intellectualism becomes not a mindset, but a community. Not just belief, but a badge of honor.
What I have just described is only a small fraction of the common sense revolution that is now, because of us, sweeping the entire world. Common sense has become a common theme, and we will never go back. Never going to let that happen.
Breaking this cycle involves more than simply telling someone to read more or think harder. It requires an entire cultural shift, one that reclaims effort as something meaningful instead of shameful, one that recognizes discomfort as a sign of potential growth. It means questioning the narratives that tell us ease is always good and effort is always embarrassing. Because true intellectualism isn't about sounding smart. It's about being willing to think, even when it's hard or slow or uncomfortable. In a world so obsessed with speed, appearance, and ease, the act of thinking deeply may just be one of the most radical things left to do. And so, this isn't really about punk. It never was. Punk was just the opening chord, a cultural symbol loud enough to grab attention, familiar enough to evoke nostalgia, and fragile enough to break open. But the critique from the very beginning was aimed at something much larger, the quiet, creeping rot of society that treats thought like a threat. Anti-intellectualism is not a simple disdain for academia or philosophy. It's a defensive posture, a cultural armor forged in fear. Fear of being challenged, of being wrong, of no longer recognizing the world you once understood. It often looks like hostility or mockery, but underneath, it's always fear. We live in a culture where the act of thinking too much is often pathologized, where nuance is flattened, where asking why is seen as an attack, and where complexity is mistaken as pretension. And yet, it's not because people are incapable of thought. It's because they're conditioned to avoid it. Conditioned by institutions that prize obedience over inquiry, conditioned by histories that equate dissent to disloyalty, and by narratives that make comfort synonymous with truth. This is the fear of the mind, of its restlessness, its questions, its refusal to settle, and it's never new. It's baked into the American psyche. It's what drove the blacklist of the 1980s, what gutted universities during McCarthyism, what now fuels school board bans, anti-DEI rhetoric, and the impulsive reaction to anything that demands introspection. It's precisely because of this history that intellectualism, true, rigorous thought, matters so fucking much. Not just in universities or online debates, but in how we live, how we form our identities, how we navigate power, culture, and change. The resistance to anti-intellectualism is not harmless. It's not just a difference of opinion. It has consequences. It shuts down conversations that need to happen. It delegitimizes entire fields of knowledge. It creates generations who view critical thinking not as liberation. And most dangerously, it leaves people vulnerable to simple answers. Answers that promise certainty without scrutiny, identity without reflection, power without responsibility. Thought doesn't have to be frightening. In its purest form, thinking is an act of care, a willingness to look deeper, to get it wrong, and then get closer to something more right. It is, in many ways, the most human thing we can do. In a society that increasingly asks us to numb ourselves, to choose sides, to regurgitate, to perform, choosing to think is a quiet form of rebellion. So, I'll say it again because people don't seem to hear it. This was never about punk. It was about the mind and the danger of abandoning it.